my learning from Rick and, understanding the evolution of consciousness primarily through his articulation of it, it became really clear to me, at least in my opinion or my mind, that it required this 2,000-year process, a movement from the Christ event to the discovery of the three outer planets and the disenchantment of the modern era, in order to fully forge the autonomous individual. And that the discovery of Pluto, I don't think it's like the final piece necessarily. Like there'll be other Chiron was discovered, other planets, but in order to begin the full realization of the divine within all human beings, Pluto is essential. Like in Cosmos and Psyche, two of the four chapters of evidence are with Pluto, Saturn, Pluto, Uranus, Pluto, and it's the depth of the human psyche, that the id, the Freudian instincts, that is, the Plutonic archetype represents. And that was an essential piece for us to discover in order to recognize that dimension within us, and at least to see it in a symbolic form in the cosmos. So it just kind of pointed to that. And then later I was in the baths talking to Jeremy Strawn about it, and he then mentioned to me about Steiner's prophecy of the 1930 period. And so that seemed to really, connect.
Yeah. What year was Pluto discovered exactly?
1930.
1930. Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like right in between World War I and World War II, and at the Great Depression, but also like in the midst of the depth psychological revolution. Jung was also discovering synchronicity in the mid to late latter 20s. He first mentions it in 1928, right after the Solvay Congress, with the
quantum physics,
of quantum physics, and yeah, so I feel like that dimension is, part of what I'd like to discuss, I guess. And then it also seems, I don't know, relevant to the meta-modern understanding of Christianity that you've also been having discussions with people about, and the meaning crisis, Vervaeke's articulation of that, and how, but the problem of the fourth, it seems like there is a way in which, like, the body aspect of it, the incarnate, the physical dimension of it, the suppression of the feminine, but the birth chart is that a representation. It's it's an image, I think, of the self in the capital S sense of what, because it's a picture of your individuality incarnate at that moment, at least separating from the mother's body anyway. And then as you are connected, as each and every human being is connected to the archetypes, as a reflection, I mean, your chart reflects, everyone's chart reflects that, our, how we relate to them ultimately.
It's just occurring to me now how the problem of the fourth for Jung being about the body, the feminine, evil in some sense. It's like the Plutonic archetype, also everything that's been repressed.
Exactly.
And I know, I mean, you probably saw that immediately, and I just am recognizing that, and this really potent nest of ideas that you've thrown out, how connected Jung's problem of the fourth is to the Plutonic archetype, and the importance of reintegrating what's been repressed and oppressed and denied. And we say Pluto was discovered in the 30s, but more recently, what was it, like 2014 or something? It was demoted and not even considered a planet anymore. And
yeah,
something poetic in that, a
mm-hmm.
bit hubristic on humanity's part as well.
Yeah.
But there's such an interesting I mean, what's really profound to me about the astrological perspective, as Rick Tarnas lays it out, is that embedding it in this historical narrative um, helps us make sense of all the unconscious forces in history
Yeah.
in a way that we wouldn't otherwise notice, and the patterns that we wouldn't otherwise notice, or patterns that we maybe intimate, but become much clearer when you can see the planetary cycles in the backdrop.
Exactly. Like both, I think, the birth chart, like you're saying, Pluto is, so much of what is repressed and unconscious, but every archetype has an unconscious dimension, or at least they're all in the unconscious, right? In the archetypal unconscious. And looking at one's birth chart can help you see your own unconscious dimensions. Like you
Yeah.
can come to know them. I mean, and I think like Jung's understanding of them as autonomous, as beings, as living gods and goddesses. Um, there's always a deeper dimension that's hidden, that's part of the unconscious. We'll never exhaust our understanding of them. But the image in the birth chart is both, it can be very helpful in seeing our where our
Mm.
unconscious in our
Yeah.
consciousness is working. And exactly, I think, the evidence in Cosmos and Psyche is it basically reflects how the collective unconscious participates in history.
Right.
And what it does also is the it it's supportive or reflective of both a quantitative dimension of time, in that the planetary alignments happen for certain periods of time that we demark
Mm.
with certain orbs of influence, but it's the qualitative dimension of time that they reflect.
Mm.
And it's the qualitative dimension of our lives as our transits unfold, our personal transits unfold. It corresponds both to the quantitative dimension, but in a much more profound way, the qualitative
Yeah.
of time.
And
Um,
we're so modern people are so alienated from the qualitative dimension of time. I mean, it's hard to ignore seasonal changes, but even there, because we live mostly inside in climate controlled
mhm,
environments, we
mhm.
live mostly under electric lights. Like even the seasons affect us less.
Yep.
Um, and astrology provides an invitation, back into relationship to the texture, the subtler texture of time that's not simply one day after the next on a
Right.
linear timeline.
Right.
And so it's hmm. I mean, I like how you were emphasizing image, and that like the natal chart is an image of the soul.
Right.
And Jung would always remind us that we don't experience the archetype. We experience the image of the archetype that that reaches our conscious mind.
Mhm.
And so I think understanding astrology as as a compass for exploring the imagination, rather than trying to say make it scientific
Right.
in the sense that we understand empirical science as measurement and calculation, and like we can be certain that this is that and that is this.
Right. And repeatable experiments,
Right.
that's never a part of
Right.
it. It's
Right.
always new.
Yeah.
Everyone's participation is unique.
So, I mean, there's a deeper sense of what we might mean by science, where we maybe would want to say that astrology is a science, like the way that like the German idealists would talk about Wissenschaft as um, the power of getting to the essence of something and like truly knowing it. Yeah, of course, astrology is that. But when I say it's not, I feel like a lot of debates about astrology um, nowadays about how, oh, it's been scientifically disproven, or there's no real
Right.
statistical correlation, this and that, is missing the point entirely. And rather than try to make astrology scientific in that quantitative sense, we should do what you're saying, which is recognize that it's a way of navigating the imagination, and that the natal chart is an image of our soul. And that when we're talking about imagination, we're talking about imagery, we're talking about something that can't be objectified.
Right.
We exist in and by virtue of imagination. Like,
Mm.
I don't have an imagination. You don't have your own imagination. Like, we exist in the imagination.
We exist in psyche
Yeah,
as you
exactly. So
said.
imagination
Mhm.
here is kind of synonymous with psyche in Jung's sense,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
Hillman's, James Hillman's sense.
Mhm.
So like that shift in perspective where we're acknowledging our human condition, our embodied uh carnal existence, like that we were born on a particular day um into this historical situation that is, yeah, human and cultural, but also biological, but it's also astrological. Like
Yeah,
the whole history of the cosmos is embedded in each of us.
that's right.
And by approaching our natal chart the way the planets were aligned on the day of our birth as an image, it's like it's a gift to us, like a kind of angelic message from heaven that gives us the symbolic key that with study and ever deepening uh you know poetic relationship to our natal charts, we learn who we are.
That's a beautiful way to say it. And it is a relationship. And I think um in the same way that I think you and Tim touched on several points that, the archetypes aren't static. They're not these eternal, unchanging things as Plato kind of initially articulated them, but they're living beings and they're evolving with us. And it's a it's an ongoing relationship that can ever deepen with the more kind of poetic imaginative orientation we have with them. Um, they will continue to ever unfold with deeper insight and understanding and meaning for our lives. And what's also interesting is like I think you said not objectifying or um, but there is a way in which
Mm,
like like Jung describing the psyche as objective. There's a way in which
sure.
the archetypal astrological perspective kind of even reifies that description that there's a way in which you can see, at least like just take the 60s or the French Revolution as Rick
Yeah.
pointed out, it's like the collective psyche has an objective kind of
Right.
quality to it when we're
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I would mean when I used objective earlier, I meant more like that there's something like a mechanistic
right,
material kind of causality
right,
operating,
yeah,
and that we could create a model that would allow us to predict with certainty how everything would happen.
yeah,
But objective in the sense that Jung would say um, that there's an objective psychoid like part of the psyche, which is why synchronicities happen. I think that's, yeah, that's realizing that like just as I said, I don't have my own imagination. I mean, we have a personal unconscious, we have a personal imagination, a secondary imagination, as uh, Coleridge described it. But there's also primary imagination from which our secondary imagination derives.
mhm,
Um, and our personal, even he would distinguish even further what he called fancy from our my personal imagination, which is like um, reconstructing imitations of what we've experienced through our senses of the physical world. And imagination, not as productive, but as merely reproductive. It like rearranges our memories, basically. But
mhm,
then there's also productive imagination. But then there's primary or cosmic imagination as well. And so the psyche being able to objectify itself through astrology in a way is like us being able to recognize that our organism is coextensive with the cosmos, and that when we're looking at the planets in their orbits and the alignments they appear to make from our perspective on the Earth, as
Mhm.
if the Earth were at the center,
Right.
that image is us looking, it's like us being able to look at the uh, it's as if we were able to look into our own brain and like see our thoughts happening from the outside or something.
Yeah. And yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's fascinating to think that there's a way in which certain aspects of what we consider subjective experience or subjective mind is on some level, not entirely, not in any absolute way for sure, is actually is made objective
Mm.
um, by being able to see a natal chart, someone's transits. There's a way in which you actually do are able to see an objective dimension of what is participatorily experienced as subjective.
Mhm. But
Um,
these archetypal objects are living beings,
you know,
and so we're in relationship to other um, souls or animate
mhm,
beings who have their own agency.
yep,
And so this isn't while we relate to an image that we know is based upon a kind of projection. Like we imagine that the sky and the place where the planets appear in the sky um, are in those positions, but we also know that that's relative to our position on the Earth
mhm,
and our earthly perspective, our geocentric perspective.
mhm,
And so there's, when we talk about astrology as a compass for the imagination and our natal chart as an image, it's like um, we have to remember this is a kind of as if scenario. Um, I think what's beautiful about astrology to me is its metaphorical power.
mhm.
And that's not because I think I wouldn't want to say, and then we have science to give us literal truth,
Right.
because science is also rooted in metaphor
Yep.
um,
Yep.
from top to bottom. And so, but I guess I'm trying to, as Rick always says, astrology is the gold standard of superstition in our culture.
Mhm.
And a lot of people have this knee jerk reaction to the very idea that would be taken seriously.
Right.
So I think it's important. The reason I keep emphasizing like imagination and image and as if and metaphor, I think, is to remind everybody of our situation as human beings that, yeah, maybe it would be nice if we had access to objective facts and that everyone just had like the same pre-installed rational intellect that always got the right answer when it considered the facts.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the situation we're in. Um,
Honestly, I don't even
Thanks.
think we really should aspire to that. I think you and Tim touched on that a couple times, like, in the sense of, that there would ever be a place where all truths would be realized and like we would eliminate mystery or eliminate the unknown or the unconscious. There's no, I don't think there's any place in the future that the unconscious will not be even larger than however far our consciousness
Yeah.
evolves.
So rather than trying to master the world or
Right.
gain control over the unconscious or something, it's about coming into relationship
Exactly.
with a mystery.
Yeah.
And astrology is a language that the mystery seems especially responsive to, in the
Mhm.
sense that it's a spiritual path that uh, invites us to a renewed intimacy with the cosmos, and with ourselves.
Deeper, yeah, with ourselves, exactly.
Mhm.
Mm, yeah. And to the more, the more awareness and study and practice we engage with the archetypes within ourselves and within the world, um, the less unconscious we are of them. And the more our agency, our will, our thinking, feeling, willing can actually enact and co-creatively enact and participate with them in more conscious ways rather than unconscious expressions, or being, even ultimately the real shadow form is being fully possessed by
Mm.
the shadow dimension of archetypes, which you also see in tragic figures in history.
Pluto is about not just repression and oppression, but possession too, right?
That's right. Yeah. You can be
Um,
possessed by any archetype. All,
right.
yeah. They all have shadow.
Mm.
Mm,
So,
mm,
you mentioned one of the ideas in this sacred nest we're building is what Rudolf Steiner said about Christ in the etheric,
mhm.
which he's borrowing this theosophical term, which is a way of referring to life, to what is alive in us as human beings, in all animals, and all plants, and all organisms. There's something more than mineral
Right.
in our being, and so the etheric is something that each of us have. We have an etheric body in addition to our physical body, Steiner would say, and the earth has its own etheric body in addition to its mineral body. And our physical senses only show us the mineral body of the earth and of our own bodies. We only see the mineral surfaces, but
Right.
um, obviously, in the case of of us as human beings, we experience more than just a bunch of particles falling in the void. We have this emotional and we have this willful way of being that's something in addition to the mineral part of us. And you see this so clearly when somebody dies. All of a sudden, there's a corpse in front of you. Whereas before, there was a soul with a
Mhm.
body, but the body is like the face of the soul. It's the soul's way of expressing its earthly existence. And so, the etheric might seem esoteric at first, but it's really something quite obvious. It's right.
Mm,
It's not right in front of us in the sense that we can see it with our eyes, but
right.
it's right behind everything we can see that's alive.
Mhm.
And so Steiner talks about Christ in the etheric as how the second coming, and to put it in more immediately accessible religious terminology, would be not a physical return of a physical body, another Jesus
Yeah.
type, you know, but being, but instead the revelation within human souls, within human consciousness, the revealing of a dimension of reality that would be not only us becoming capable of seeing the life of the world around us, but also that it's been saved by this Christic force, this power of love. It's been saved from death.
Mm,
And so that death, what we might imagine as death in the material world, in the physical world, has been overcome.
mm,
And the Christ in the etheric is the revelation of that as a kind of spiritual fact. And Steiner
mm,
thought that more human beings would become aware of this beginning in the 1930s,
mm,
probably for astrological or, I think ultimately astrological reasons. Why
mm,
that date? Why then? I think um, Steiner was deeply attuned to astrological cycles and
mhm.
didn't just make these dates up.
Right.
And Pluto's discovered in 1930. Okay, what else is happening at that point that might signal that, yeah, some human beings are beginning to see Christ in the etheric? Well, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin is writing The Human Phenomenon
Mm,
in the late 30s, but these ideas are incubating and especially heating up for him, already by the beginning of that decade. And so
mm,
that's this French Jesuit paleontologist seeing the evolutionary process as that led to the human being as intrinsically spiritual,
mm,
and that is actually evolution that best describes the story of evolution is the best description of the incarnation.
mm,
That's how God grew a body
mm.
through the cosmic and biological evolution.
Right.
And Teilhard saw that so clearly. And we might quibble about the scientific details, but the basic vision, like he's basically saying to Catholics and to Christians, look at evolution, look at this process. You
Mm,
couldn't ask for better evidence of your God and the story told in the Bible.
mm.
And so that's new.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
and
Go ahead.
and Plutonic. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing I really took away from your and Tim's discussion of an answer to Job was how seeing that as an evolution of consciousness process, that it was, God's unconscious, the shadow dimension of him as to, why Christ was necessary in the sense of the divine incarnating into human form,
Yeah.
and then having that be a pivotal
Why it
kind
was psychologically necessary, like whether or not we could, Jung would bracket the metaphysics and theology of it and just say
of. Hmm.
psychologically, this story is this is how souls in the Western world at least develop.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so
Yeah, and then to push that forward in the sense of the prophesied 2,000 year second arrival of that principle, but
mhm,
like you're saying, not in a singular human form again, but in all human beings. And I think
right.
that points right to Pluto's discovery and the etheric body being realized, perhaps within all human beings. And I think that is something really unique about astrology, is that it can afford that compassion for every human being, because it it reflects every human being as a sacred center of cosmic love. Your birth chart is a reflection and, in a sense, an instantiation of how the cosmos loves you and is affording you the opportunity to reflect with it, to deepen your relationship with the divine, because the archetypes are connected to it, and they are instantiated in you, in the individual human being, in everyone at that moment, at least as an image reflected at that moment of when the human body separates from the mother. Um, and then, furthermore, it's how your psyche unfolds in time relative to the transits, your own personal transits, which afford a deeper ongoing relationship to how your psyche is unfolding in relationship to that principle. Um, I really loved how you guys closed um, with um, Jung's actual final um, sentence in Answer to Job. It says, "Even the enlightened person remains what he is, and is never more than his own limited ego before the One who dwells within him, whose form has no knowable boundaries, who encompasses him on all sides, fathomless as the abysms of the earth and vast as the sky." And I think
Mm,
that's it. The presence of that, of the divine principle, is instantiated both within and without in the cosmos itself. I mean, the planets are living symbols of these beings. And I think one thing that you said in the problem of the fourth dialogue was how, when you bring up Jung in class and people ask, like, okay, what do we need? Do we need a new symbol system? And you're like, well, yes, but we can't just force it. We can't create through science these new symbols. And then you say, I think really spot on, is that Jung would say that the symbols are there, but they're already there, they're already present, but what we need is a new relationship to them. And I think that's the essence of our discussion here, in a sense, or how the problem of the fourth can be like, how we can move more towards enacting or incarnating it is to change the nature of our relationship to the symbols. Um, and that it, in a sense, we're just on the threshold, right? Like yes, astrology's been with us since the beginning of time, really, but it required the forging of the autonomous self, the differentiation of the individual through the Christ event, through the modern era, through the Copernican revolution, through the scientific revolution, the disenchantment. This is all in Rick and Cosmos and Psyche. That in a sense, it required this Passion of the Western Mind and Cosmos and Psyche, that we had to go through this process in order to prepare for the possibility for a recovery in a completely new way, to forge a new relationship to the symbols that wasn't possible before the forging of the autonomous self and the differentiation and the disenchantment of the cosmos.
Yeah.
All of it, well, necessary for this new potential to arrive. But
Yeah. I think part of what the revelation of Christ in the etheric is suggesting is that the ego needs to, in order to come into genuine relationship to the one, or to the Christ, to cosmic love, the ego needs to die to itself. Like that etheric vision of the living Christ is only visible on the other side of the threshold of death.
yeah.
And you can get a glimpse of that while you're still in this body, in certain intense,
Mm-hmm.
mystical,
Yeah.
non-ordinary experiences,
Mm-hmm.
um, where you feel like you are the Messiah. And
Right.
um, that's only going to be a true and genuine experience if you've already died to your ego. Like you have to be on the other side of the idea that you are just this frail, finite being that needs to defend itself against a hostile external world of enemies. If
Right.
you haven't died to that identity, you might think you're seeing Christ, but really a you're seeing an idol. You're seeing a kind of
Mm-hmm.
anthropomorphic
Yeah.
reduction.
Right.
You're imagining, God is the most powerful chief, um,
Right.
the strong man
Yeah.
who's gonna.
That's a. Am I cutting you off?
No, no, go ahead.
That's a real danger. I mean, I think because we are empowered with such, you know, technological prowess and agency and centeredness of being in our current modern conception of the human being, in an inflated hubristic sense that we're superior to the world. We're destroying the environment because we see ourselves as separate from it and superior to nature on some level. Um, yeah, that's exactly right. And back to what you were saying about objectifying, because it's clear that many astrologers, and just in the astrological perspective, just like in everything else in the materialistic worldview and the material um, mechanistic understanding of things, is I see it too causally, and desire to control the future, and that like they can move into a mastery position,
Yeah, the
and it's
Yahweh
not.
complex.
Yeah, exactly. And it's exactly the wrong approach. And in my opinion,
Well, it
it's
was right maybe thousands of years ago,
sure.
but
And
it's
part of,
become developmentally inappropriate now.
yeah. And it's not that we want to relinquish our agency. It's a finding the balance of humility and humble, like being open to being formed by the archetypes in a relationship with them, that is recognizing our place within rather than superior on top of. It's not about controlling them. It's a matter of um, making as much of your unconscious shadow as conscious as possible so that you can be in equilibrium with
Yeah.
it. And I think that's what Jung was pointing towards with the moving towards wholeness in the self, capital S. But it requires a humility
Yeah.
to bring yourself into, I don't know, proper relationship. I don't know if that's the best
Yeah.
word, but
But part of doing astrology in a postmodern or maybe even increasingly meta modern age is recognizing that like all of the stars out there are not just holes poked in celestial sphere. Those
right.
are other systems of planets.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and so there's a paradoxical like pluralization of the um, astrological situation. And so we have to imagine our solar system as obviously like profoundly important for how we as psychosomatic and spiritual beings come to be on this particular planet,
mm,
in this particular solar system, but that there are intelligent forms of life on other solar systems with different planetary configurations where maybe we could say like the ultimate oneness is still shining through, but the way those planetary archetypes in that very different star system um, diffract that
mhm.
light of the one is going to be so different.
Yeah,
And,
unique to that solar system.
and so that keeps us humble, as you were saying, about the extent to which we've ever arrived at the ultimate um, account or like way of dividing up or a way of narrating what's going on. And so,
Mm,
when we come into when we remember astrology as I think one of the most important civilizational arts, like it's what allows us to be social together, and it's because it's what allows us to be um, more or less free and responsible individuals because we know ourselves. Astrology is an essential civilizational art, and I think
mhm,
to the extent that we regain a relationship to this way of making metaphors together about what's happening,
mhm,
we'll begin to be able to not only understand ourselves better psychologically, but we'll be able to communicate better with one another. We'll be able to coordinate our activities through time, remember the seasons, remember how to grow food together,
mhm.
remember these larger scale cycles and the rituals that are supposed to accompany them so that we can respond to what's happening in a mutually enhancing way. I think astrology is at the core of the renewal of civilization, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'd like to think so.
And
I also,
civilization in the highest sense. I know there are some
yeah.
anarcho-primitivists who have many valid points, and I mean
Mhm,
civilization,
mhm.
not in the exploitative
Right,
way that it's been
right.
manifested so far.
Yeah. I'm also really conscientious of like some of the warnings that Tim brought in your discussion about, we don't want to impose. It's not about saying astrology is this end all or something, and um that it would be a violence to try and impose a symbol system on the collective. It's something that has to emerge from within. It has
Yeah.
to, and but it is exactly as you're
Like,
saying.
is it persuasive or not? We're not trying to
Right,
force, we're not trying to
right,
force it.
right,
Just
right.
consider it. Is it persuasive? You be the judge.
And really the only, Rick has said this many times. I mean, I think Cosmos and Psyche is um, one of the best um, uh, accumulation of evidence for the existence of the truth of astrology. And not just that, I think on a certain level, it validates the archetypes in an objective way. And when I say that, like, I mean, I'll just give this analogy real quick. Like, if it were not accurate, like, I don't know what percentage, I mean, I think 95% of what is in that book is accurate. But if it weren't actually true, what he's articulating there, if it were something that he had imagined,
Mhm.
it would be a much more astounding feat that he would have had, imagined these correlations between what had been given as the archetypal principles of these planets and being able to synthesize them in relationship to history, to the collective psyche, that he actually, creatively imagined this as like a play, that would be a much more astounding accomplishment than if
Mm,
it were actually true.
mm,
And that's where I feel like it's it's one of the best um, accumulations of evidence that actually demonstrates the validity. But what he
mm,
does say is that um, it's really your own experience, your own personal experience of your natal chart and seeing it correlate in your life is what is going to be most convincing
mm.
for people. It's not going to be seeing the collective psyche and
Unless you're a historian,
I mean,
and
on some
maybe
level, I think some people, yes, but for the most part,
people like to,
you're gonna need to see it validated for your own experience. And
yeah,
I think it does that. I think with the proper lens and the with good readings and and doing it like you're saying in relationship. It's
mm,
no one astrologer or one person, or you're just looking at it yourself. You're not going to be able to see everything in the same way you can't see your own shadow. You need psychological reflection and therapeutic counsel ultimately with other people to be able to see aspects of our own unconscious. And I think this is
yeah,
also true for astrological practice as well.
yeah. I think we don't originally have the capacity to see our own shadows, but we can learn to see our own shadows.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
and it's
astrology can help.
yeah,
Good. But
mhm.
yeah. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think with words like truth and accuracy and objective, I think we need to reevaluate what we mean by these terms because I think in the modern period with the scientific materialist attempt to master and control nature,
Pin it
there
down.
was a certain conception of truth and accuracy that was radically um, a reaction against anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism, and basically saying, you know, the human being and human morality and human art and human um, aspiration is all just sort of this ephemeral, um, ultimately meaningless epiphenomenon. And what's really going on is this objective set of material conditions that are um, unfolding according to mechanistic laws
Right.
that just are happen to be what they are and for no particular reason.
Right.
um, and so truth and accuracy becomes this way of um, sort of decentering the human and affirming in a kind of heroic way
Mm,
ultimate meaninglessness, nihilism.
yeah.
Like, and the scientist feels proud that they've accepted the harsh reality of our pitiful condition. And there is a kind of tragic beauty to that whole situation, but there's a way through it. Like that's not the end of the story.
Yeah.
And so we need to reevaluate truth and accuracy, I think, in a less alienated way and in a more participatory way. And
Mm,
and so in an astrological context, when we talk about truth, we're talking about mm, a clear insight into um, how our own personal experience of life aligns with something that is greater than us, that is larger than us, and that we feel a sense of resonance with what is actually occurring. Um,
yeah.
and so truth is rediscovered in an astrological context as like a way of being in resonance with other with yourself and other people and the world around you.
Hmm. And absolutely. And it's also, I think, edifying to realize that um, quantum theory, quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, um, renders a universe that is at its ground participatory. that, it's the observer. There is no neutral observer position from which that objectification of reality can actually take place. That, if we look for particle, we find particle. If we look for wave, we see wave. And so it's dependent. The universe itself reveals itself in relationship to how it is, how we participate in it. So it has this undetermined, indeterminate, uncertain dimension at the core of the nature of reality. And so it's a process relational phenomenon, just like, like Whitehead realized. And I
Yeah.
think that's one of the most important insights that comes out of quantum mechanics, is that understanding that it's a relational process, and and if it's actually that indeterminate dimension is what allows for creativity, and what allows for novelty, both in the cosmos, but also for free will and the human being. If it were to have had this objectified, determinate truth at the core of it, then the idea that we could predict everything and wouldn't be able to know everything would follow suit. But that isn't the case, and we can't, and it can't. And I think that it's the complementary dimension of both reality being particle and wave, and at the same time, and that you can't ultimately pin down either one in an exactitude. It's what allows for the freedom, and the novelty to emerge. So I think, our best science is supportive of exactly the worldview that we're describing, which is a participatory, relational one.
Yeah. Well,
And
certainly after quantum physics, there's no scientific justification anymore to support the metaphysics of materialism. Science moved on from materialism over a century ago.
Mhm, mhm. We're
And
just catching up.
yeah, psychologically,
Psychologically. Yeah.
psychologically catching up. Um,
Mhm.
I think, yeah, I mean, objects and observers, or rather, objects and observation are inseparable.
Yeah.
We can talk about observers, you know. Um, yeah, okay, so this is the Trinity, the object, the observer, and the process of observation itself,
Mm,
Father, Son, Spirit.
mhm,
And so that Trinity can that's powerful. I mean, that's in some sense, that's everything that's happening.
mm,
But
mhm,
then I finish saying that, and there's this silence and this sense of the brooding presence of something other
mhm.
that has been left unsaid,
Right.
that hasn't been given her due.
Mm, mhm.
And so the fourth as a problem, and it's definitely a problem, comes onto the scene. And I think astrology actually helps us address that because, I mean, look at all the dismissive um, insults about how, like, the jokes about how only women could really take astrology seriously, and
Right.
because
Yeah.
it requires you to put your rational mind aside and just be more emotional, intuitive, and like in the flow of what's happening around you. And I think that is a sense, that is that correlation, that association with the feminine, and a way of knowing it, like astrology in our patriarchal cultural context, I think speaks to exactly the problem of the fourth, and the way that there's mm, integrating the shadow is always going to be a kind of embarrassment for the consciousness that had been dominant before the integration occurs. And so there's a process of, I mean, we have to hold space for the grieving of the rational ego as it dies to the possibility of certain knowledge and mastery and control
Mhm.
over a material world.
Yeah. And in so doing, allowing or giving the irrational its due, you
Yeah.
know. what
or the
is
non-rational at least.
the non-rational.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, yeah, astrology is irrational from the modern materialistic mind. But I think there's another way in which you, if you fully grok quantum mechanics, that like, it's the atom is 99% empty space, right? Like tiny proton, smaller electrons, and the space in between them is ultimately larger than, metaphorically, larger than the space between the sun and the planets.
Mhm.
Space, the solar
When
system.
we try to measure it, that's all true. When we try
Yeah.
to quantify it and calculate it, those
Yeah.
ratios are absolutely true. But
Mhm.
but metaphysically, I don't believe in empty space, I gotta tell you.
Well, yeah, I was a stand-in. My point
Right.
ultimately is that like you don't question the relationship between the electrons and the nucleus. It's what makes it is. There's clearly a deep uh,
Yeah.
relationship that's happening there, and I think the
Yeah.
same is true on the larger scales.
Right.
There's a unitive, an underlying unity, a wholeness that
Yeah.
exists. That yeah, like you're saying, it's not actually empty space.
No, it's full
There's
of,
a relational process taking place.
yeah,
Mhm.
it's relationship all the way down and empty space, with the materialistic um reproductive imagination, or what we fantasize as this material world that exists independent of us.
Mhm.
Um it's mm, it's just it's a symbol. Well, it's an idol. It's like we've
Mhm.
conjured it out of ourselves. And so like the tragic fact of the matter is that like materialism scientific materialism and its like passionate um you know striving to like wake humanity up from its dogmatic slumbers and superstitions. The tragedy is that it was actually the one committing the most profound idolatry by conjuring this materialistic dragon into existence that we in our intelligence and courageousness needed to conquer. um
The fallacy of misplaced concreteness, right?
Misplaced concreteness, yeah, like we invented nature as a source of resistance to our um patriarchal project to master the universe. And that is the superstition. Like
Mhm.
materialism is the superstition.
Yeah.
And I think I'm feeling how just because of how much our modern civilization has invested in the materialistic myth, just like how painful it is to let go of that.
Yeah, it's a really good point you make about grieving the rational ego's desire to be able to have a full mastery of the world and
Yeah.
of knowledge of our understanding of reality.
Yeah.
Um, it's not going to be possible, and um, yeah, we have to hold space for that grieving.
Mm. We have to hold space for it and also like be like responsive, because like we're witnessing nationally and geopolitically the playing out of the grieving process of this autonomous ego.
Yeah,
And the nation state is the collective projection of this ego principle. And there's a bunch of these giant ego nations duking it out, even though a lot of us as individuals have reached a developmental stage where we recognize that if we keep doing that, we're going to destroy ourselves. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
nuclear weapons just made that technologically uh, necessary. That,
yeah,
but we already knew. Like, if we don't get a hold of, like Jung said, it's like what was he really worried about? Not the nukes themselves. He was worried about us. He was worried about
yeah.
the human
The
psyche.
psyche,
Like,
that's
what
right.
if something goes wrong with the psyche? And
Yeah,
clearly, something has already and is going more and more wrong with the
yeah,
psyche.
yeah.
Um,
That's where I feel like astrology as a compensatory
Yeah.
and it's the humility that we have
Strong
to,
medicine for
yeah, right.
our situation.
And or just think about, like, astronauts like Edgar Mitchell and some people who've gone into space and just been like, wait, no lines, no nations. What are we doing? Like, we're all Earthlings, like it's that cosmological perspective, that frame of reference that moves beyond the nation, the individual, human beings, even, to recognize that we're all part of a much larger mystery than we can fathom, but that we're all a sacred dimension of it ultimately. I think it's not only human beings that astrology kind of informs. You can actually see it in animals and stuff, or like events, things that happen. There's every everything that emerges in the phenomenal world has an archetypal astrological correlate. And in that sense, uh, it sacralizes all things, and it can help us move into an understanding of unity, of wholeness, that transcends all the divisions that the human mind places onto reality, and many for good reasons and necessary. And there's, it's a paradox as well. I mean, we are finite human beings that are born and die. And there's a limited nature to our physical existence. But as we, know the soul is eternal, and it transcends the body, and it lives on, and ultimately it's a higher truth than the fallacy of the misplaced concreteness of our sense of separate identities. Um, I mean,
Mhm.
that's another way, I think, just even psychologically, it's like no human being exists on their own. Like our personalities even are completely enmeshed in every relationship we've ever had. You take away your relationship with your mother and father, your siblings, but you're not the same person. Like we don't exist as individual, subjects in that absolute sense. We
Yeah,
exist as
which is why we
relational.
can each forgive ourselves and why we are each forgiven, right? Because like we don't exist independently of each other, and
Yeah,
becoming responsible for your own karma is it's a difficult lesson. Astrology can really
totally.
help with this,
Yeah,
but like to accept that everything that you might initially think other people are doing to you is actually your own doing.
right.
I mean, that's what forgiveness means.
Yeah. Mm.
That's a really difficult. I mean, that's part of dying to the ego. It's just
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if I understand Jung's quote here, he says the apprentice piece is the encounter with the shadow, the personal shadow, but the masterpiece is the encounter with the anima mundi, the soul of the world. And it's
exactly.
like we're talking about what's truly a difficult process in the apprentice piece, but we're also talking about the masterpiece that's required ultimately, it seems, for our survival,
Mhm.
um, as
Yeah.
a species.
Steiner talks about two guardians of the threshold, very similar, the lower and the higher guardian of the threshold. And
Mm,
um, I feel like astrology is a guide on the way, through these thresholds. And it allows us to redeem the individual by reconnecting the individual to the universal. And
yeah,
I think there are a lot of reasons to be critical of individualism, but by reconnecting to the universe through this astrological archetypal practice, we're able to transcend ourselves in a sense, but
yeah,
it's a transcendence inward, like through what is most personal, what's most intimately ours. But it's also so relational because we're in a situation now where there are the nationalists, and then there are what do they call them? The identity politics. I mean, it's all identity politics, whether you're a white nationalist or a, Black Lives Matter activist. It's
right,
like
right,
um, discovering what's unique about you as an individual doesn't deny the color of your skin. It doesn't deny, the cultural and ethnic contexts into which you were born, but it allows you to discover that you're always more than that,
right.
and that you're always also sharing a common world with every other being, right? And so redeeming the individual by reconnecting them to the universal, and thereby allowing us to get along with each other and not artificially dividing us into these national or racial groups that, again, it's not that we aren't embodied and incarnate beings who always exist in these socioeconomic and ethnic conditions. We can't ignore that. I'm not talking about being colorblind, but I'm saying
Right.
we are each individuals, and astrology is a pathway to learning about how you are an individual and yet also in relationship with everybody else beneath the same sky, right? Subject to the same weather.
The same archetypal complex is ultimately arranged in different forms.
Yeah. Same cosmic history.
Yeah. And it provides the opportunity to really cultivate a depth of compassion for one another because we're all in it together. And every human being is invited, right, to the new, you know, to participate in the relationship.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
Oh, it's a beautiful vision. Um,
Yeah.
maybe can we talk a little bit, just I mean maybe to get more topical and timely with our astrology. Pluto
Sure.
went into Aquarius
This morning,
this morning, this afternoon,
this
12 around
afternoon.
12:30 for us here in California.
Yep.
Um, You'll be there for what, like 20 years?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure. I think so. It's roughly like 14 years, but it's slowing down. Pluto, it's in a very elliptical orbit.
Right.
So it's starting to slow down. It was, at its peri perihelion in the last 80 years or no 40 years. Like I think in 1980 it made perihelion, I mean it's its closest point to the sun. And that's where it's been in a 60-degree relationship, a sextile to Neptune, basically inside of Neptune's orbit. And they've
Mhm.
been moving at the same speed for the last 30 or 40 years. And it's beginning to slow down now because it's beginning to go into a longer part of its orbit. So you may be right. It may be up to 20 years.
Mm.
Pluto will be in Aquarius. So,
First time in
yeah.
250 years that it's been in
So,
Aquarius, roughly,
mhm, mhm,
248.
yeah.
And
Which is the age of the United States. Yeah.
mm,
This is called the Pluto return for the United States. And it's very topical for our struggle with power and the unconscious and that orientation towards dominance and control and projecting the evil or the unconscious onto the other. But yeah,
mhm.
go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, so on the one hand, it sounds like we could be entering into a really dark period, but also Aquarius is a very future-oriented kind of humanitarian and universalist type of
Mhm,
sign, and so
mhm.
Pluto moving into a relationship with Aquarius seems like there might be some lightening of the destruction or some way that that destruction will be channeled creatively to create new conditions, for a future civilization to flourish.
Yeah. I mean, I love, Ion, Jung's Ion. Its, orientation was, or, Pisces, the age of Pisces was the fishes, right? And Christ being a representation of the movement in, or, the age of Pisces, Christianity being. And then I wanted to actually use this quote real quick from Ion, paragraph 286. He says, we now have a symbol, and he means the self. Um, so we now have a symbol in place of the fish, a psychological concept of human wholeness. In as much or in as little as the fish is Christ, does the self mean God. It is something that corresponds an inner experience, an assimilation of Christ into the psychic matrix, a new realization of the divine Son, no longer a theomorphic form, but expressed in a conceptual or philosophic symbol. This compared with the mute and unconscious fish marks a distinct increase in conscious development. And I
Mm.
think, I think his hope was that the age of Aquarius would bring about an emergence of the self into its wholeness, being able to recognize or incorporate the unconscious with consciousness in a balanced way, so that the human being could, I don't know, not be complete necessarily, but move into a higher form of wholeness, of understanding of the self and the individual human being collectively, in a sense, like the collective individuation um, that would be brought about um, with the age of Aquarius. And I think Pluto moving into Aquarius is a potentially a very beautiful sign for that reality to be emerging, um, just as maybe Steiner's kind of prophecy of the discovery, or of Christ etheric body beginning to be seen in 1930.
Yeah.
Um,
And he spoke about it increasingly being seen by more and more human
mhm,
beings in the
mhm,
next 2,500 years. And so, like,
mhm,
as we
mhm.
really do shift into a new sign,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
this was definitely part of the age of Aquarius.
Mhm,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, mm, I think, you know, maybe we should try to put a bow on this. And I find myself wanting to remind anyone listening about the mythopoeic and imaginative nature of astrology, and about the mythopoeic and imaginative nature of human existence.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
that there's no need to think about an understanding of how we relate to planetary movements from the perspective of the earth and our own consciousness. There's no reason to think of that as in conflict with science and our best understanding of the nature of the physical world. Because as you were saying, and as so much of your research, really digs into, quantum physics has totally undermined the materialistic, mechanistic conception of the universe. And
mhm.
Pauli, Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, and Jung, were engaged in a deep dialogue about the relationship between psyche and cosmos, and what's been opened up through the scientific study of nature is a very different picture of causality, um, that's not mechanistic, that's non-local, and that seems to have a mm, a qualitative texture. Like, it's not just material, it's meaningful.
Yeah.
And we can only understand it when we discover patterns of relationship between our own observation and the objects that we're observing.
Um,
And astrology is just an invitation into that kind of a participatory relationship with what we observe going on in the sky we share.
yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating, the Pauli Young correspondence. They were primarily oriented, I mean, a good part of the discussion, the dialogue, was focused on striving to recognize a neutral language that would bridge or form a conjunctio between physics and the psyche, or um, you know,
Mhm.
science and religion. And um, he called it they called it the psychophysical problem. And it's fascinating because, Pauli was actually instrumental in encouraging Jung to write synchronicity. Um, he was Jung actually thanks Pauli for inspiring him to write the monograph. Um, but what's interesting is Pauli didn't like astrology. He didn't recognize its value um, up till 1953. Um, Synchronicity was released in 51, I believe, 50 or 51. And but they're in their correspondence. There's at one point where um, Jung is writing a letter to Polly, and he says, he says, oddly enough, it's the 2,000-year-old problem that still exists. How does one get from 3 to 4? And later, Pauly, he actually doesn't write this back to Jung, unfortunately. Their correspondence kind of broke down right around this period. But he was in conversation with Mary Louise von Franz, and he wrote to her saying that he had somehow recognized the value of astrology, and he described it as it was 2 by 6, like the wheel into two, but then six divisions of houses, but really of the signs. But then he says by 3 by 4, because which it's 4 angles, right?
Right. Yeah.
And there's 3 divisions within each,
Mhm.
and it's that recognition of the quaternity of the natal chart. And then he says something along the lines of, my way is 2 by 6 or 3 by 4 to the zodiac. And he says, because what is old is always new, is the quote in the letter. And it's really, it's interesting because like as a neutral language, I mean, I honestly think we can recognize astrological symbolism as just that, as in a sense as the logos, or I don't want to say the, like, um, but as a form of logos, both in the Heraclitean sense of like an ordering principle or reason, what gives reason to the world, like cosmos and psyche, in the sense like the evidence
Yeah.
there gives reason to
Mhm.
what is otherwise just a mysterious history in a sense,
Yeah.
and but also in the Christian sense of it is the word of the divine. It is a divine language, an archetypal language that's connected to the divine, that is also within the human being and instantiated within the cosmos. So it's got this particle and wave and linguistic structure that I think can be seen as neutral in a sense, and also unifying physics or the material world, the phenomenal world, and the psyche,
Mm.
are the soul.
Mm.
Psyche in Greek meant soul, right? Where we get our word psyche, or our
Yeah.
word mind, or mind, the understanding of psyche. Psyche actually
Mm.
meant soul. And I think I think from a certain perspective, um, astrological language and the astrological practice can be seen as a neutral language that does form or represents the possibility for a form of a connuntio. Um, but
I think I agree. I might word it a little differently just by saying instead of neutral language, maybe it's like a noetic language, because I think it's value laden. Like astrology is value laden. Like it
that's a good point.
has a moral vector to it.
Yeah,
So it's not neutral in the way that, a materialist might say, like, oh, I don't have a metaphysics.
right,
I'm just describing the facts and giving you the best
right,
model we have for
right.
determining what happens. As there's something intrinsically um yeah, there's a value assertion, that the
Mhm.
universe is a communion, that relationship is what's fundamental.
Yeah.
And to see the sky, I agree completely with you that the sky provides us, and the movements of the lights in the sky provides us with a language, a logos that is common. It's there for all to see. We can agree more easily about what's happening in the sky than we can about anything else. So
Mhm.
it's the best image of the ideal world that we have in the sensory world.
Mhm.
And so it's an image we can interpret and have, I think, a very high degree of faith in as individuals, that like it's true for all of us, and so
Yeah.
we already have astronomy, in the modern Western world, we have astronomy that we appreciate for its truth and accuracy. But if we want to understand that knowledge that we have astronomically, and if we want to understand physics, then we're going to need to overcome this sense-bound intellect, rational ego consciousness, because the Euclidean picture of the universe that ego has is an idol. It literally is a fantasy projection.
Yeah.
It's the hallucination.
Right.
Science has shown us that that can't possibly be the real world, and to come into relationship with that scientific knowledge requires becoming a different kind of being.
Yeah. That's beautiful, Matt. I totally agree. Noetic language, that's more resonant. And I think, Polly was saying a neutral language is more
Mm.
his wording. I think because he was striving for something that would be palatable to the modern scientific mind. And then he always referred to mathematics as a neutral language.
Mm.
But it's interesting that even math, numbers are archetypal.
Right.
So even mathematics on some level isn't fully neutral when you really grok it, and maybe it's not even like an ideal that we should have, that there could be an absolute neutral language in the same way there won't be an understanding of a completely objective universe that we can understand. So
Mhm.
um, yeah, that's a
So just to say number is
real point.
archetypal then is to say like there's a qualitative difference between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. You're not just adding the same thing over and over and over again. There's actually a quantum leap occurring between
Yep,
each number.
yep,
And so the qualitative always outcontextualizes the quantitative. The quantitative presupposes the qualitative
yep.
or the archetypal.
Hmm.
Um, and so again, it's like not astrology is not, I should never become, we should never imagine astrology as in competition with science or physics.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um,
Exactly.
it's complementary.
Yeah, perfect.
Mhm.
Perfect. Yeah.
So this has been a lot of fun. I think yeah, I like that metaphor that I used earlier about this as a nest of ideas that we've kind of built together, and that maybe it's a home that people can come nest in us with.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and we can begin to like reweave our shared existence on this planet, you know, because we need a common story. And I
Mhm.
think it's, I talk about astrology with people, like people I just meet for the first time, and some of them are super open to it and like, oh,
Mhm.
cool, like I'd love to learn more about this. And other people are like, what?
What's wrong with you? Yeah.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have that app, but what are you saying? Uh, and I get that, but I also think it might be that we need to get that weird to make it through this evolutionary bottleneck, and that like reintegrating what we've been repressing and acknowledging, if we really want to acknowledge the feminine and overcome patriarchy, if we really want to welcome in other ways of knowing, if we really want to decenter the European colonizing rational intellect, then we might want to look in the direction of, a depth psychological, um, participatory astrology.
Yeah. I agree 100%. And I think ultimately it's from the right perspective, it it doesn't actually, I would use the word destroy, but that's not right. Like we're talking about before, the humility that's required, and the grieving of rational ego that is going to have that humility. Um, when you understand it, like it doesn't actually destroy the identity that one has cultivated in the materialistic world. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like it, in a sense, it contextualizes it, but it doesn't.
Yeah, all is forgiven.
Yeah, yeah, and like the same with the religious impulse. You know, many, I'm sure many, believers of different religions would also have this same kind of resistance to astrology, but like it doesn't deny anyone's faith in what they believe. It doesn't discount it. Um, it actually supports it. The Uranus Neptune chapter in Cosmos and Psyche points to how all these religious movements have a Uranus, many have a Uranus Neptune correlate. So it's more contextualizing and reifying, if anything, um, different perspectives, science, religious, even the mechanistic, on some level has its place. Um, but it's
Yeah.
but it's like, hopefully a limited place. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think like building train models in your basement is really cool.
yeah, right.
There's a place for the mechanistic.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, I think computers, I think used in a responsible and wise way can be really valuable.
Clearly.
There are ways that we need to like weed whack that situation and like
Mhm, mhm.
miniaturize our computing technologies to not be so domineering
Right.
and that they're actually dehumanizing
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, social media has only been around for what, 20 years.
I know, right?
Has there ever been a more destructive weapon in human history? I
A
don't
good question.
think so. Still keep doing it. I mean, at least the US keeps doing it. I think China and
Yeah.
Europe are like catching on, like, oh my God, we gotta
Right.
curtail this a little bit. I'm not saying I'm in favor of more government control of how we communicate with each other, but
Right.
technology is out of hand. And I think astrology is a way of not rejecting technology in the deepest sense of like how the arts that human beings have cultivated in order to mediate our relationship with the rest of the universe, with nature.
Mhm.
Technology can be really destructive of nature, but also it's not like we have a choice.
Yeah.
Technology is a way that, like nature is art. What else is astrology saying than that the cosmos is an artistic expression, a drama? Um,
Tremendous amount of beauty that
so
runs
it's
all
not
the way
that
through.
yeah, it's not that technology is bad. It's that we need to be more artistic about it
Yeah.
and less functional or less obsessed with efficiency and some abstract metric of progress. And I
Yeah.
guess it's measured in terms of how much more dominant we think we become of the world around us. That's progress.
Right.
When really what that mentality has done is um, push our whole industrial civilization to the verge of collapse.
Yep.
And
It's
so,
highly destructive.
yeah,
Yeah.
the obsession with control has made our society more fragile than any prior. I mean, yeah, there's 8 billion people or whatever, but we're hanging off a precipice and supported by a form of technology that is so out of sync with its ecological conditions and the actual rhythms and cycles of time and place. And so like we really need a geocentric um corrective. And
Yeah.
I think like
Yeah.
return to the earth and recognize our embeddedness here. And that means like considering how the rest of the cosmos looks from here.
Yeah.
You know, reimagining science and what it means to know in a way that includes the human instead of pretending like nature exists separate from us and that we are not part of nature.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a participatory relationship all the way down. Yeah.
Did we leave anything out?
I don't think so.
I don't know. I still feel Maybe it's like I smell, I catch the whiff of the fourth still
Mm,
brooding.
yeah,
I think that's a great work that will take a few more thousand years.
yeah,
We're beginning. We have the right idea, but we haven't
mm,
realized that yet.
yeah. No, I think the incorporation of evil is the most challenging dimension of it, really. I mean, and like I pointed towards the unconscious and the shadow, how it's reflected in our charts and stuff, and that can help us see that. But it seems like, good and evil are archetypes. And no planetary archetype is either good or evil. Both can participate in them or in a sense be possessed by them. And our ability or capacity to both acknowledge it and then integrate it on some level, rather than repressing it and causing a need for a compensatory reactionary, um, place of for evil to react to our suppression of it seems to be the most challenging, you know, task we have. Um, and then even being able to recognize it exactly, because so much of what we do or what we were doing in technological industrial society and all these things had these seemingly evil dimensions to them that we weren't even aware of. We had no consciousness of, in the beginning, of like burning everything was going to cause global warming, and like we just there's ways in which we're just it's part of our shadow. We're right, it's a part of the unconscious. But being able to strive to bring it into consciousness and then integrate it in a healthy way seems to be extremely difficult project ahead of us. But
mhm.
yeah. um,
Yeah. Well, I think that project will be, aided by the quality of attention that we pay to our collaborators, our celestial collaborators who, you know,
yeah, yeah,
are here to help us by indicating the most mm, healing way to integrate our karma and our unconscious. You know, therapy is something we can engage in as individuals, but it's also something we have to do collectively and culturally.
mhm,
And an archetypal history and an understanding of how planetary patterns and cycles relate to cycles of civilization can help mitigate the effects of each particular moment in history. Like
that's right.
we can connect with the larger story
Hmm.
if we have this astrological technique. And without it, we run the risk of, I think, being too caught up in the present and the immediate zeitgeist, which is
Yeah,
important too. We don't want to be out of touch with that, but
no, but
to see the larger patterns is, I think, orienting and helps us preserve our sanity and
yeah,
gives us a sense of context. Um,
yeah. One thing, I don't know, it seems to me that this is just a hypothesis I have, that it's the idea that second order thinking, as Elkanah described, emerged in the axial era, right? Thinking about thinking,
mhm,
that self-reflective process. But it kind of seems like the astrological vision that we're, hinting at here, or, on the verge of perhaps seeing, um, actually does intimate the possibility for a third order of thinking, where we are doing the self-reflective, critical, analysis, but we're doing it with the archetypal beings that are informing our thought process. So
Mm.
it's another layer in which perspective can be accessed so that we aren't as possessed. I mean, just to give a simple example, like when the Saturn-Pluto alignments happen, there's more of a tendency for psychological splitting and othering. The Saturn boundaries come in and the good's on the inside, projecting the Plutonic evil, the repressed, the shadow onto the other. But knowing that they're in alignment at any given time and seeing it in the collective psyche, it affords you the capacity to not fall into and be possessed by that type of thinking. So it does seem to me that it's perhaps um, a new level of awareness that can be brought into being, but it will take a lot of attention, like you're saying, and cultivating that awareness, and a lot of will, ultimately, like Steiner's saying. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I mean, I find myself thinking about the myth of Pluto and um,
mm,
sort of king of hell, and the the way in which like integrating evil means being able to empathize with the pain that must be present in a being who would want to rule over the pain and the suffering and the anger and the rage of the world, but also the great sacrifice that is represented by that deed,
mm, mhm,
like Satan, the devil, takes on the sin of the world in a way, also
mhm,
paradoxically parallel to the way that Christ takes on the pain of the world. Like
mhm,
Satan
mhm.
takes the blame,
Right,
like Judas takes the blame,
right. Mhm,
and in some way also, even in being the most evil character in the story, also maybe somewhat secretly, but once you see it, it's like, how could I not have noticed how much more profoundly that expresses the very love that Christ is trying to display. And so
yeah,
um even the devil is redeemed, I think,
yeah,
is part of the esotericism on offer here.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no part that's left out. Um, yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think this larger frame of reference can help
Yeah,
us have compassion for the whole.
it makes possible a new kind of social coexistence.
Hmm.
Like if we can hold out the possibility that even evil can be redeemed, then we can forgive each other.
You know,
Because we're never going to escape history if we can't forgive each other. We're going
yeah,
to get locked into the nation state ego complex battle to the death.
right.
And now we have the technology to actually finish the job. Like we could finish the job. And so if we don't escape that complex very soon, like literally, like maybe tomorrow, like we might actually need to do it tomorrow. I'm serious.
Yeah, yeah,
We're and we've been at that place for 60
right,
years,
right,
70. I mean, since the nuclear bombs like have been on offer
right.
and multiple nation states have had them, we've been right up at that precipice. And I can't tell you that I'm not sure that aliens haven't intervened to prevent us from actually doing it. Maybe that happened.
Or angels, or yeah, I
We're
mean,
angels.
yeah, no
It's
doubt.
it's that we're talking about something supernatural here, whether we believe in angels or just human technology. We have the
Mhm,
ability to destroy ourselves.
yeah,
So the angel of death is upon us. It's like,
yeah,
and
yeah,
our deepest and most primal sense of relationship to everything that there is, which is what astrology is trying to address, is super relevant in a situation like this.
yeah. Well said. Well said. Yeah.
Well,